Hello! I wasn't gonna make a new video for a while. I wanted to finish the stuff I'm currently reading before I turn a camera on again, but my new video on Evangeline Walton has really been blowing up, and so I figured I might as well strike while the iron is hot and do what was originally going to be a top 10, and then it quickly became a top 15 favorite fantasy reads video just because there's a lot of books I want to talk about. But the main conceit of this video is that for the most part this won't have the sorts of novels you would see on other booktube top fantasy novels list, just because, I like Mistborn well enough. You don't need me to tell you to read Mistborn because you have all these other people who are already telling you to read Mistborn. And so I want to share 15 novels that are special to me that might be relatively under-discussed in this sort of context, which isn't to say that you won't have heard of any of them. But I think there will be some of them that will be brand new to you. If they are and you find them interesting, then I hope you check them out. One more asterisk. Some of the major booktubers will include the manga Berserk and or One Piece on their lists. And I think that this really opens up a huge can of worms, because if you're including the medium of Japanese manga, it brings up all these questions like, why not include Delicious in Dungeon, which is one of the best D&D stories ever? Why not include Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind? Because the manga is a lot better than the movie, by the way. The manga goes to some wild places. And so I am very intentionally not including any manga either, because I could talk about manga at length. I could make a top 15 manga video as well. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know. I'm going to just jump right into things. First off, this would be in the top 5 or the top 10, but I am only including it here at the top of the list in a provisional position because I have not finished reading it yet. And that is The Wars of Light and Shadow by Janny Wurts. This is just one of the best epic fantasy series I have ever read. In the 80s, 90s, Wheel of Time, door stopper fantasy mode. It's about two half-brothers, Lysair and Erathon. They both have magic, they are both princes, and they are both stunningly handsome. The two of them have a history. They hate each other. Lysair controls light, and Erathon controls shadow. Mild spoilers for the first book, Curse of the Mistwraith, so that I can talk about the general shape of the series. In the first book, Curse of the Mistwraith, they are tasked with settling a curse that has been plaguing a fantasy world for several hundred years. This demon called the Mistwraith. And you think, oh, that's going to be the rest of the series. They're trying to defeat this demon. No, they defeat the demon halfway through the book. They are able to seal him away, not for forever, just for a while. But the thing is, the demon is able to curse both of the brothers so that they hate each other on sight. Not just like, I hate that guy. More like, I am going to use my untold magic to cause unmediated amounts of harm to myself, to my friends, to the environment, just so that I can get at and kill the other brother. And Erathon, our protagonist, the Master of Shadow, is self-aware about the fact that he is cursed. And then Lysair, who is this fascist in the Griffith mold, is not aware. And so what the series is, you have Erathon and all of his allies constantly on the run from the growing political might of Lysair as he unites the world under the forces of order and justice. And Lysair is just sort of the definition of lawful evil. But at the same time, Janny Wurts is able to humanize him, even though he does all of these awful actions in the name of what he believes to be justice. He never becomes a cartoonish villain. And on the other hand, Erathon, who is more of our protagonist, this depressed bard who would rather be making music, but he realizes that he has a commitment to protecting the people around him from the overreach of Lysir's allies and his organization. And so in order to defend the people he loves from Lysir, Erathon will occasionally have to do these acts of violence because that's the only way to save as many of his friends as he can. But when Lysir sees that, he only sees a terrorist who just started killing people for no reason, right? And so you have Lysir committing atrocities against Erathon's allies, and then Erathon just doing whatever he can by the skin of his teeth to stay alive, because even though he and Lysir are warring against each other, only the two of them together can defeat the Mistwraith, who is still in the background doing evil stuff. The scope of it spirals out. It includes multiple factions of magic users. It's a series with some of the greatest wizards I've ever seen in fantasy. They are so fun. The prose is absolutely immaculate. Every single word is carefully chosen. Another important thing to point out about this series is that Janny Wurts clearly has an extensive history in both seamanship and horsemanship. You don't realize how unrealistic horses and boats have been portrayed in other fantasy series until you see Janny Wurts talking about them, and you think, God damn. So I have only read the first 8 books so far. The whole series is split up into 5 sub-arcs. I have finished 3 of them. The last 2 arcs kind of make up a final trilogy, and I am very excited to read those later this year with Song of the Mysteries. And then once I finish The Wars of Light and Shadow, it will easily go in the top 10 at least. Until then, it'll just be here in a provisional role. I had to cut myself off because I could talk about Wars of Light and Shadow all day. I could do a whole video about it. So number 15 is something I don't have a copy for because I don't think it has ever been officially released as a book per se. So I am going to hold up a completely unrelated book to the camera. You have to hold something up to the camera. I'm going to choose Revolt of the Dwarves by Rose Estes. This is a D&D Choose Your Own Adventure. Number 15 is The Eye of Argon by Jim Theis. I don't know how his name is pronounced. The Eye of Argon is infamously one of the worst fantasy stories ever written. It has this deeply purple prose. It's just a mind-numbingly stupid adventure about a barbarian named Grignir who goes around fighting gelatinous ooze, saving maidens, and so forth. Jim Theis wrote it when he was 16. I don't know the full story of it, but it somehow ended up at a convention. All these 70s fantasy authors made a whole game of reading The Eye of Argon aloud to each other. Every time you stumble over one of his misused words or one of the deeply stupid one-liners that Grignir says, you have to take a shot. And so it was like a huge drinking game. I think in recent years there's more of a backlash against Eye of Argon as a point of fun. Jim Theis, he never leaned into it like Tommy Wiseau does now, right? Jim Theis died a decade or 2 ago. He didn't like that everyone made fun of him for something he just wrote when he was a 16-year-old, Just imagine someone making fun of you into your 50s for a fanfic you wrote as a teen. I can see a huge amount of the audience shuddering about that. So why am I putting it on this list? Because I think it's unironically awesome. The Eye of Argon is a legitimately fun time. It is an actual fun read. What makes it such excellent sword and sorcery is because it has a complete lack of guile or self-awareness. It is so committed to being itself that it actually kind of transcends the sword and sorcery subgenre. People are too self-aware about the genre conventions these days. And what makes The Eye of Argon such an awesome read is because it fully believes in itself, even though it is one of the most deeply stupid pieces of fiction ever written. An additional thing that I like about it is, this is such a minor thing, but as part of a lot of the misused language in this book, Grignir will habitually refer to men as sluts. He'll see a bunch of old wizard cultists who are about to sacrifice a maiden, and he'll say, "Stand away from her, you sluts." And these like 200-year-old evil wizards are like, ah! Number 14, Lord Dunsany. I don't remember his full name. Lord Dunsany is his title, but it's what he's published under. One of the most beloved pre-Tolkien fantasy writers. His most famous work, The King of Elfland's Daughter, which pioneered a lot of tropes about elves and whatnot. And it's a beautiful and wonderful read. But I am not choosing The King of Elfland's Daughter. I am choosing another book that I actually don't have a copy of, called The Gods of Pegana. The Gods of Pegana is an absolutely fascinating read. Another short read that you can just read right now on Project Gutenberg in under an hour. Lord Dunsany was fascinated with ancient mythology and pagan gods and idols and all of that. So The Gods of Pegana is him writing his very own original mythology in the same vein as Genesis. But it has kind of a amusing satirical bent to it. If you ever read Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling, it has a lot of the same tone. In The Gods of Pegana, he invents a completely original pantheon of weird gods, and he just tells a bunch of stories about their lives and their battles and whatnot in this, again, Genesis-like mythic language, which isn't for everyone, but I think if it hits for you, it really hits. My favorite of the gods is Mung, who is the god of death. Every single time someone or something dies, Mung shows up, and they always say, Mung performed the sign of Mung, and that's how he summons people to the netherworld. And A, it's funny his name is Mung, and then B, the 200th time you read about him making the sign of Mung, it really warms the cockles of your heart. I'm going to read a small excerpt about Mung off of my laptop. The Deeds of Mung. Once, as Mung went his way athwart the earth, and up and down its cities and across its plains, Mung came upon a man who was afraid when Mung said, "I am Mung." And Mung said, "Were the 40 million years before thy coming intolerable to thee?" And Mung said, "Not less tolerable to thee shall be the 40 million years to come." Then Mung made against him the sign of Mung, and the life of the man was fettered no longer with hands and feet. At the end of the flight of the arrow there is Mung, and in houses and cities of men. Mung walketh in all places at all times, but mostly he loves to walk in the dark and still, along the river mists when the wind hath sank, a little before night meeteth with the morning upon the highway between Pegana and the worlds. Just absolutely beautiful. I mean, to me, I think that sounds awesome. Lord Dunsany wrote one or two more collections of stories about these gods. I think it's most often collected today under the title Time in the Gods for the full omnibus. There's also a Ballantine that collects most of the stories. I do not own it. Number 13, I finally have a book, The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson. I briefly mentioned The Broken Sword in a past video, but I will give my spiel again. The Broken Sword came out the exact same year as The Lord of the Rings. Fascinatingly, it also has all of the exact same influences that Tolkien drew from as well. The Icelandic Eddas and the Norse sagas and all of that. What makes The Broken Sword so fascinating and what makes it an excellent counterpoint to Tolkien modulated all of these Viking tales with a Christian ethos of kind of goodness in humility. And Poul Anderson, as a ethnic Dane, I believe, I think he was a first or second generation immigrant to the United States, he did not. So this is uncut Viking brutality. It's the story of two semi-brothers. You have the human hero Skaflock, who is taken by the elves when he is a baby. He is raised in the land of the elves, and he is replaced by the changeling Valgard. There is this changeling guy who grows up in the human world in Skaflock's place. And then these two counterparts end up growing up in fundamentally different ways, and they come into conflict with each other once the realms of fairy start to war against each other. This book is bloody, it is dark. To give you an idea of the places it goes, it has the same twist as Tolkien's Children of Húrin. So if that means something to you, then you kind of know, like, oh, it's going to do that. Number 12 is Little Big by John Crowley. John Crowley, one of the great literary fantasy authors of the late 20th and early 21st century. He is still writing today. This is unfortunately the only Crowley book I have read so far, but I hope to read more. Little Big was a critically beloved fantasy novel in the 1980s. Notably, it even impressed that wizened literarch Harold Bloom. If you don't know Harold Bloom, he famously hates everything on the planet Earth that isn't Shakespeare, and sometimes Cormac McCarthy. He was like one of the most important literary critics for decades. So you would read an intro to a book written by him, and it would just say, this book's good, but it's not as good as Hamlet. And you think, come on, dude, whatever. But he loved this book, which is hilarious. Little Big is the story of the Drinkwater family. It sort of has the same structure as Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, in that you're following one family over the course of decades, all of their associates, all of their loves, and just all of the different bizarre ways that they become integrated with each other. But notably, it has more of a New England milieu. And so you follow multiple generations of the Drinkwater family while they live in this mysterious, magical mansion that sort of, kind of, has a portal to the fairy world inside it. But what makes Little Big, it's not like, the Spiderwick Chronicles or whatever. You don't have any fairies just show up and say, hey, I'm a fairy. You have all of these subtle, surreal ways that the magic emanating from this house kind of infiltrates the lives of the characters, and it causes them to go off the rails in some truly curious and bizarre ways. But at the end of the day, it's mostly a slice of life novel. It really is one of the most casually romantic novels I've ever read, just in terms of like the sheer intimacy that is portrayed on screen. And I don't mean in a R-rated way, just in terms of the small beauties of daily life, casually stroking someone's hair while the sun is beating down upon you, stuff like that. A beautiful book. I hope to read more Crowley soon. I've got a couple of his books, but I'll get around to them eventually. Number 11, Creatures of Light and Darkness by Roger Zelazny. Roger Zelazny is most known for his Chronicles of Amber series. Those books are really interesting. I don't love them as much. I think, they kind of go up and down a lot. And then he is also known for his Lord of Light, which is a space epic about Hindu gods. The Lord of Light is a science fiction novel disguised as a fantasy novel. Creatures of Light and Darkness is the inverse. It's a fantasy novel disguised as a science fiction novel because it is Dragon Ball Z. This book was written in 1969, but it is just straight up Dragon Ball Z with Egyptian gods. You have all of these rival factions of Egyptian gods in space, as typified by Anubis in the House of Death and Osiris in the House of Life. And they are battling each other for supremacy across the galaxy or whatever. I need to read it again, but it has the most insane fight scenes I have ever encountered in basically any work of prose fiction. Everyone's teleporting around. They're like, ha, I knew that you would be there 30 seconds ago, and so I anticipated your move 27 minutes in advance. And you're just reading and thinking, like, what the hell? And it is independently a very crazy novel on top of that, right? Roger Zelazny actually just wrote this as a writing exercise. It'll cut to poetry randomly. It'll cut to a screenplay format, but it only exists because Samuel R. Delany thought it sounded awesome and got Roger Zelazny to sign off on it. Quietly one of the most crazy novels I have ever read. It's very funny too, so I highly recommend it. Number 10, I love Diana Wynne Jones. I grew up reading Howl's Moving Castle. My grandmother gave me her personal copy. I read it until it literally fell apart in my hands, so I don't have it today. But I am not going to do Howl's Moving Castle. I am going to do The Tough Guide to Fantasyland, which she also wrote. And what this is that this is a fake satirical guidebook for a tourist who is traveling to an alternate fantasy dimension and what they should expect. And basically what this is this is TV tropes in a book. It's styled as an encyclopedia. You can go to any entry for any concept or trope that exists in fantasy literature. Here's pulling something up. Guards. Guards are the town watch and quite useless. They will always arrive too late to quell a tavern brawl or riot. This is because there are too few of them, and all of them are stupid. Tourists will be glad of both these facts at that point when they are trying to leave the town unseen. Anyway, stuff like that. What's interesting about this book, because this is kind of a comedic non-fiction book, she actually wrote a novel companion to this called The Dark Lord of Darkholm, which is about a fantasy world such as this one, where capitalists from Earth arrive and they force everyone in the fantasy land to take on stereotypical positions so that they can sell packages to tourists, that they can come to this fantasy world and save the land and whatever. And so this random guy, this blacksmith, gets press ganged into being a Dark Lord even though he doesn't want to be. Number 9. When the last eagle flies over the last dusty mountain. It's The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, one of the greats. This is a library copy. I weirdly don't have my own copy. I am currently wearing my Last Unicorn shirt, and then I got my Last Unicorn VHS tape on display, so, you know, I'm making it up. This is such a bad cover. This does not indicate what the movie is like, by the way. This movie is dark. But it's one of my absolute favorites. It's been one of my favorites for 15 years. I'll, like, show it to people I'm dating, and they'll be like, why are you crying at the unicorn movie? To which I have to respond, wouldn't your heart be broken too if Molly Grew, the middle-aged woman who went her entire life without ever having seen a unicorn, finally gazes upon the last unicorn and she is forced to contemplate her own life choices and her loss of innocence? It's one of my favorite and one of the saddest sequences in film, and then also in this book. The movie was written by Peter S. Beagle, and so the book is pretty much nearly identical to the movie. There is one or two things that are in the book that the movie cut out. So if you don't read this book, at least watch the movie by Rankin Bass. That's what I'm saying. It's just one of the best movies ever made. And this is one of the best books ever written. So either way, you can't lose. Number 8. The Iron Dragon's Daughter. This is a novel by Michael Swanwick, who is mostly known in science fiction spaces. He wrote this deeply psychedelic novel inspired in equal parts by Shakespeare and Gene Wolfe called Stations of the Tides. It's a great book. He is also renowned for writing this, The Iron Dragon's Daughter. I think I originally found out about it because China Miéville mentioned it on this list he wrote called like 50 fantasy novels for socialists or something. Iron Dragon's Daughter is about a girl named Jane who gets sucked into the realm of fairy as a child, and she is the only human girl around. She is put to work, even from a very young age, into a factory where she has to produce parts for a giant, sentient dragon mech, the Iron Dragon. Eventually, she steals the mech and she frees herself to a point, but she is still stuck in this other world filled with fairies and monsters. She just has to grow up. She has to go to fairy high school and fairy college. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds like Sarah J. Maas or whatever. That couldn't be further from the case, because Michael Swanwick wrote this as an anti-fantasy novel where he wants to subvert all of the comfortable tropes that readers have come to rely on fantasy over the years. And I find that he does that by actually returning to a more ancient form of fantasy storytelling, because the fairies in this, they are not fun or good. They're lots of weird, horny little freaks. Imagine the same dynamic as Labyrinth or Pan's Labyrinth. You have this one human girl, this one sane girl, with all these little gremlins who are like, would you like to give us a blood sacrifice today? You know, she's just looking out for number one. She is looking out for herself, even though she is deeply depressed. It seems everything she does causes grievous harm to those around her, both the people she doesn't like and the people who she does like. If you look at the score on Goodreads or whatever, you'll find it's rather low. One complaint is that Jane is a fundamentally unlikable character. You know, she betrays people, she's always stealing. I've seen multiple reviews just call her a slut, which, I don't know, I don't think that's very nice. You should only use that word to to refer to old wizards. But I think that Jane is a fascinating and endearing character, because I think she is one of the most realistic teenagers I have ever seen in fantasy fiction. And then the other complaint is that, oh, the world building's so chaotic, I can't keep track of anything. And hey, guess what? You know what's also chaotic? Puberty. You know, I think of this novel as kind of the ultimate Bildungsroman. This is Neon Genesis Evangelion, but with dragon mechs, quite literally. So if that sounds awesome for you, check it out. There are 2 sequels that Michael Swanwick wrote later in the same universe, one of which I have right here. But this is the last in the trilogy. I still haven't found the second one, so I haven't gotten around to them yet. Number 7, The Dark Eidolon and Other Stories by Clark Ashton Smith. Clark Ashton Smith is one of the trio who is said to have pioneered weird fiction, along with H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Howard. All 3 of them wrote for, what was it called? Weird Tales magazine or something like that. Clark Ashton Smith, I think, is both the best writer out of all of them, and he's also the least racist, which is, you know, points for that, right? The Dark Eidolon is the Penguin compendium of a lot of his most famous tales. He also got a bunch of Ballantine releases. I only have one of them. Hopefully I can find more someday, but they're in high demand. But I would say that this is probably the easiest way to find his work and track him down in current year, because Clark Ashton Smith wrote short stories. They are really fun, bizarre little tales, but his first passion was poetry. And so why I like this collection is it has a huge amount of his prose poems and his straight up poetry. And it's just some of the most beautiful lyrical description I have ever read, but it has this truly grimdark fantasy edge to it, which I'm surprised that more people don't write in that same vein. Another thing that I personally love about Clark Ashton Smith, I can see it being a turnoff for a lot of other people, is his dense vocabulary. Clark Ashton Smith, I don't believe he ever went to high school. He literally learned to read by memorizing the dictionary. That's just how he taught himself everything. He just literally read and memorized the dictionary front to back. And so you have the most unusual word choice, just tons of words I have never heard before. I kept a document the whole time while I was reading this collection of new words I had never encountered, and I ended up finding like 200 words. I could do a whole video where I just read those words off for you. For their feet are founded on innumerable worlds, remote and alien epics, and their arms upraised are columns potent to exalt with ease ineffable the countless thrones of all the gods that are, or gods to be, and bear the seats of Asmodai and Set above the seventh paradise. Fuck yeah, dude. So cool. Number 6. The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you've watched some of my other videos, I have the position that I think a lot of people limit themselves by thinking, I couldn't possibly read that, it's too hard, etc. I will admit, I read the first third of the Silmarillion back in middle school. I thought it was nice and all. You know, I liked the Ainu Lindale. I thought the Valaquenta was boring, which it is to this day. And basically, I burnt out there, and I wish that I could have told my younger self to commit to reading the full thing, because I stopped before it gets good. I guess I'm just talking as if you know what the Silmarillion is. The Silmarillion is Tolkien's companion to the Lord of the Rings, which does the entire history of men and dwarves, and especially elves, in the tens of thousands of years before the events of Lord of the Rings. And it truly recontextualizes everything you read in Lord of the Rings. All of the references suddenly make sense, and you understand why the elves don't do more to help, and it's because they are literally so traumatized. They have capital letter PTSD from everything that happens in this book. And they're just like kind of too shell-shocked to really be of much use. The only elves who can help really are Elrond. Elrond only gets born at the very end of this, so he misses most of the really serious stuff. And then, you know, Legolas, who was only born a couple hundred years before Lord of the Rings happens. The way I think you should read the Silmarillion is read the first half very carefully, go at your own pace, you know, don't press yourself too much. Tor.com, what is now known as Reactor Mag, had this really wonderful set of blogs, like a read through that kind of like helps you internalize all of the characters, because they throw the names of 36 elves at you and they expect you to know how to keep them apart. You know, like, yes, Finarfin and Fingolfin are two brothers, and they have very different plot functions, so you better know the difference to them. Admittedly, the roughest chapter is, the one that everyone hates, is Of Beleriand in Its Realms, because that is the chapter where Tolkien goes very slowly, bit by bit, through basically every single country throughout Beleriand, which is the kind of Middle Earth before the Middle Earth that we know today. And he like tells you who's ruling there, and he tells you like what the deal is. And it's a famous spot where the book sort of grinds to a halt. But I would say that if you're reading the Silmarillion, just take it at your own speed. Make sure you internalize all of these names, because the Silmarillion is a roller coaster. The first half is entirely setting up all of the stuff you need to know, giving you all of these names, all of these peoples, as it goes chunk, 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 up the coaster. Because shortly after that chapter, things kick into gear. The real chapter where it goes hard in the paint is Of Beren and Luthien, where you get the story of the first human-elf romance. From there on out, it's just non-stop action for the entire second half of the book. The roller coaster drops precipitously. You have some happy endings, but for the most part, now that you've memorized all of these different elf kingdoms, you get to watch every single one get knocked over in a row like dominoes, with some of the most horrific turns of tragedy that you will ever see, at least in Tolkien, definitely in Tolkien, maybe even in fantasy fiction. Things go so bad so fast for everyone, and you just see all of this nonstop suffering and misery and bloodshed, and you're kind of thinking, well, these elves sort of deserved it. They did a lot. They had it coming in a lot of ways, but at the same time, you also feel bad for them. And then by the end of the book, you just understand the depth of the whole world. No Wikipedia article is going to do as good a job at Silmarillion pilling you as the Silmarillion, you know. Read the Silmarillion, I believe in you. Book number 5. This is getting to the point where most of these books are kind of more considered literature with fantasy elements than straight up epic fantasy or whatever. I think anyone who is into fantasy literature would really benefit from reading the rest of these books, even if they aren't as stereotypically, you know, high fantasy or whatever. First off, Jorge Luis Borges, Ficciones. This is the collected fictions. So this is everything that Borges ever wrote. Ficciones is only 100 pages of this, but this is usually what you'll find in libraries these days. Borges wrote a lot of incredible short stories, but Ficciones is the pound for pound strongest collection he ever did. Deeply influential Argentine critic, translator, man of letters, public intellectual, who also occasionally wrote fiction. But his fiction always was mind-bending or deeply metatextual in ways that after you read every single short story, it makes you reconsider what even is fiction and what is my relationship to it. For example, one that doesn't get talked about too often, but I think is secretly revolutionary in what it's doing, I think it's called The Approach to Al-Mutasim, where Borges, like the actual Borges, reviews a book. But the book doesn't exist. It's just a book review for a fake book that he just put in an actual literary journal, and he didn't tell anyone that he was reviewing a book that didn't exist, just to see what would happen. And so you have all these people writing into the journal like, I can't find this book anywhere. Where is it? What does it mean to use fiction to invoke inside a reader a false sense of reality, right? Honestly, that's what the Chicago Sun-Times should have done. That summer reading list that was filled with books that didn't actually exist by Andy Weir or whoever because they used AI to write it. They should have just claimed that it was a statement, that it was an art project. You're like, you got literatured, you idiot. I love Pierre Menard, the author of The Quixote, a fake obituary for a guy who made it his life goal to kind of monkeys on a typewriter style recreate the entirety of the book Don Quixote. If I can just write what I imagine Don Quixote reads like, if I just like write that from my own cultural context, can I recreate Don Quixote without never having read Don Quixote once in my life? And he gets like a full chapter and a half correct or something, right? Three Faces of Judas, which is this speculative theology about the place of Judas in the New Testament, which has actually kind of retroactively been proven correct by some Gnostic documents that have come out in the last 50 years. Borges is also credited with some of his other stories, like inventing the idea of parallel universes, inventing all of these other tropes that current speculative fiction takes for granted, examining all of them with a serious literary context. I think anyone and everyone should read the book. All of the stories are very short. There's none that are longer than 10 pages. A lot of them are just a page or two. So you just like read this 2-page story and your mind will be blown for the rest of the week. So I highly recommend that. Number 4 needs no introduction. The Mabinogion Tetralogy by Evangeline Walton. Go watch the video on her. I argued in that video, and I think people are agreeing with me that she is one of the most quietly undersung epic fantasy writers of the 20th century, and she needs a lot more attention. I deeply look forward to a world where she is discussed far more. I don't have that many novel thoughts about the Mabinogion right now, so I'm just going to tell you, read these books. They're good. Number 3, this is another literary fantasy. The Dictionary of the Khazars by Milorad Pavic. This is what is often referred to as an ergodic novel. And if you don't know that terminology, if you haven't read any Espen J. Arseth or whatever, who is the dude who made up that term, ergodic literature is literature that requires significant input on the part of the reader in order to parse. Choose your own adventure novels would be ergodic literature. Maybe the most famous work of ergodic literature is House of Leaves by Marksy Danielewski. You're reading through the book and it's so complicated in terms of its very format that you are forced to like turn it upside down and do all these crazy things to comprehend it. Dictionary of the Khazars is, well, it calls itself a dictionary. It's really more of an encyclopedia. In many ways, it's actually a spiritual companion structurally to the Tough Guide to Fantasyland, right? This is a novel by Yugoslav author Milorad Pavic about the Khazar peoples, who were a steppe people who lived in the Eastern Caucasus, I believed, around the 9th century. We don't know that much about them in terms of just like raw historical data, but the folklore says that 10 centuries ago, the Khazar people mass converted to Judaism. And so you suddenly had this huge Jewish population where there wasn't before. That's pretty uncommon throughout history, to say the least. And so what the Dictionary of the Khazars is it's a magical realist retelling of the Khazar peoples. One day, the Khan of the Khazirs brings in a rabbi, a priest, and an imam, and he says to them, hey, pitch your 3 different religions to me so that I can choose for my people what religion we're going to be. This book examines that event through the format of 3 encyclopedias, one of which is an encyclopedia from a Jewish perspective, one from a Christian perspective, and one from an Islamic perspective. And all 3 encyclopedias assert they're the ones who won the contest, right? So the book is structured as a bunch of different encyclopedia entries for different peoples and dates and concepts that correspond with the 3 different religions. But importantly, all of these different entries that are written in this lyrical, magical, realist fashion don't have enough information to be a standalone story. So you need to compare and contrast these 3 encyclopedias with massive disparities in order to try to parse out the secret stories that lie through all 3 encyclopedias. And it's not just about this event too either. It follows the history of the Khazars from centuries onward, from basically the ancient world all the way to the present day. Because these are structured as a dictionary, you are getting all of these different concepts and time periods totally out of order. This is a book where you could do the Always Sunny, insanity board behind you, where you're just like trying to figure out what's going on. You read any one entry and it's just such beauty. I gotta reread it. Hello, future me here. Look how harsh this sunlight is. I am cutting out a 10-minute rambly monologue, basically made all the footage unusable, so I am re-recording this right here. Number 2 is Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. These are the Tor Essentials re-releases. That's how I originally read them. In the years since, I have found 3 of the 4 original Timescape editions. I am still missing the original book, Shadow of the Torturer, because that's in very high demand. You can see the original cover art on this re-release. It's one of the most iconic covers in all of fantasy. Fun fact, this Art is done by Don Mates, the husband of Janny Wurts, the author of Wars of Light and Shadow. I also have a Czech copy that I picked up in Prague earlier this year. I think it is very funny because of how weird and generic it is. This is a Sword of the Lictor, the third book for people keeping track at home. Anyway, back to your normal show. What is the Book of the New Sun? In fantasy spaces, one of the most storied pieces of literature. It's about a young torturer named Severian who comes of age millions of years in the future, which is so far distant that the sun is dying, everything's just kind of lit by this dark red glow. Society has degraded from its once spacefaring heights to just this medieval, heavily Catholic influenced society, which is why we have a guy who is employed as a torturer. And so Book of the New Sun is the story of Severian coming of age, finding out who he is, and maybe sort of accidentally becoming a Christ figure and king of the universe or something along the way. And so he is writing his memoirs about his youth, telling you about his journey. But what makes Book of the New Sun so infamous is that Severian, he is the most unreliable narrator in all of speculative fiction. He keeps telling you, like, by the way, I have a perfect memory and I never get anything wrong ever because I have a perfect memory. But he will constantly contradict himself, mess up details, if not like straight out lie or lie by omission. And the fun of Book of the New Sun is not only trying to figure out what the meta plot is, because like the world building is so dense, it's kind of hard to tell at times what is going on, but also just like what's Severian's deal. And the further you read through the series, you find out that he has more deals than you initially thought he had. There's more going on with him. This is a book that is beloved by know-it-alls. And so I think Wolf fans have sort of developed a bit of a negative reputation. If people say like, oh, I didn't really like Book of the New Sun. Oh, you didn't like New Sun? What's wrong? Was it too deep for you? People are annoyed when they're reflexively told that they didn't like a book because they're too stupid for it. Anyway, I don't want to be that guy, even though it is kind of fun to be smug about the series sometimes. What my position is, I think that even if you choose not to engage with the deeper metatextual stuff or like the weirder stuff that's going under the surface, because you can like listen to literally thousands of hours of podcasts where they just try to figure out like what was going on with the lizard witch in that one scene. I don't think New Sun is actually that hard to follow moment to moment as just like the adventure of a guy getting into some crazy shenanigans. And the tack I will take in recommending New Sun, usually when people recommend Book of the New Sun, they're like, it's so mysterious and it's the Dark Souls of literature and you don't even know what's going on. I'm going to say the opposite. I think Book of the New Sun is hysterical. I think it is actually a very funny book to read. It's not a ha-ha book, but it's funny when you sort of realize the disparity of what Severian is telling you on the page versus what's going on in between the lines. I think one of the most notable examples of this that gets debated heavily to this day is his treatment of women. A lot of people read Book of the New Sun and they're a little disturbed or upset by the way Severian treats women, and they often sort of say like, oh, Gene Wolfe, he's this conservative Catholic guy who is writing these books. That's his sexism leaking through. But I have always taken more of the position that you're meant to understand and empathize with the women. Severian, who is in his teens or early 20s for most of the series, is just a giant tool. But even as an adult who is like reflecting on these events, he doesn't have the self-awareness to recognize how much of a tool he's being. For example, in the first book, he meets up with a woman called Agia. He goes on an adventure with her. He's just like mumbling to himself like, oh man, this chick likes me so much. I'm doing so cool. As he's just like mansplaining things to her. To be fair, she is flirting with him, but only because she wants to rob him. Because he's just like carrying all this like really cool stuff out in the open, and he is not self-aware enough to realize that he's just making himself like a huge target. And so she's like trying to flirt with him, but he's like, oh yeah, anyway, let me explain to you how this thing works. And she's like, uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Watching her frustration with him build up in the background while he's like telling her about how much he misses his 10-foot tall girlfriend that he once had. And I find that you often have these moments of disparity, not just the women, but like different characters, where Severian has a very strong idea of how he's presenting to the world that doesn't match with how all the characters are viewing him. Anyway, Book of the New Sun is awesome. The rest of the solar cycle is good as well. Number 1, Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. That's a better angle to see it because it's sort of in a minimalist embossed cover. Italo Calvino is another literary great of the 20th century who wrote fiction that kind of had a fantastic edge to it. I count this as my single favorite novel of all time. It has been ever since I read it. I read it all in one sitting at a coffee shop, and I could feel myself dissociating as I read through the book. It was this truly magical experience. Invisible Cities is supposedly a story about the Venetian explorer and trader Marco Polo. And he is in Xanadu. He is in the pleasure gardens with Kublai Khan, who is the Chinese emperor, really Mongol emperor, who he developed a friendship with. The whole book is made up of these 1 to 3 page chapters. In each chapter, Marco Polo describes a city that he has visited to Kublai Khan. All of these cities are obviously fictional, and each city is given this magical realist description, describing its wonders, but also with a magical tinge. Like, this is a city covered in agate and marble, where whenever you step on its stones, you remember the name of someone who you will never see again, or something like that. Here's one of the entries as an example. When a man rides a long time through wild regions, he feels the desire for a city. Finally, he comes to Isidora, a city where the buildings have spiral staircases encrusted with spiral seashells, where perfect telescopes and violins are made, where the foreigner hesitating between 2 women always encounters a third, where cockfights degenerate into bloody brawls among the betters. He was thinking of all these things when he desired a city. Isidora, therefore, is the city of his dreams, with one difference. The dreamed of city contained him as a young man. He arrives at Isidora in his old age. In the square there is a wall where the old men sit and watch the young go by. He is seated in a row with them. Desires are already memories. And so as the book goes on, the descriptions become increasingly surreal, and they force you to evaluate your own relationship with cities and with places. Where is the city where you lived as a 9-year-old? Think of that city right now. You could go to the physical location of that city, but that city wouldn't exist. It only exists in your memories. And in a way, that city never really existed at all. Do all the places in the world outside of your eyesight really exist at all? Have they ever really existed? The book makes you feel small in a way that is beautiful and magical. Anyway, that's the end of my 15. This list is by no means complete. I am always reading more books. Believe it or not, I always try to read books that are good, which is to say I'm always trying to read books that could potentially go on a further top list. My favorites are changing all the time because I keep finding such new and wonderful books throughout the course of literature. If you guys want, I could do a top science fiction, top manga, top literature, etc. I don't know, my mind is blank. So I'm gonna hang up. Bye, love you.